Hi everyone, my name is Lee. My presentation is about a lesser-known part of WPA3 called Simultaneous Authentication of Equals Public Key. But before I talk about the what, let me first start with the why. And the why is Wi-Fi passwords. Now, if you think about it, Wi-Fi has a pretty strange relationship with passwords. Many security experts agree that you shouldn't write your password down. And you certainly shouldn't leave that password where somebody else can find it. So based on that logic, it would be really silly to do this. But I bet everybody in this room has seen the Wi-Fi password written down and printed out. And most people also understand that a password is something secret, something that you don't tell anybody else. Unless, of course, it's the Wi-Fi password, where we have inbuilt tools that actively encourage us to share the password with other users. Why does Wi-Fi have this unique relationship with passwords? Nobody else does this. And this is, of course, on top of the usual bad practices that we associate with passwords, such as using weak passwords or using the same passwords for years on end. And all of this creates a problem. It makes it very easy for an attacker to set up an evil twin attack. And for anyone who may not know, an evil twin attack is quite simply where you copy the SSID settings, the name, the password. If it's an open SSID, you don't even need the password. And that's all you need to do before client devices can start to connect to your evil twin. Now, you can optimize this step by sending some de-authentication messages, jamming some channels. But once a client device has joined your evil twin, you're in a fantastic position to launch any number of man-in-the-middle attacks. SSL stripping, DNS poisoning, credential harvesting, malware injection redirects, take your pick. There's a lot that can be done from this position. Now, you could be forgiven for thinking that WPA3 Personal and opportunistic wireless encryption, with all of their security improvements, would provide some additional level of protection against evil twin attacks. But actually, you could argue it makes things worse, because now protective management frames is enforced, meaning that it has just become harder for a wireless intrusion prevention system to disconnect a client device from an evil twin, making evil twins even more resilient. But there is another way. Let me introduce you to Simultaneous Authentication of Equals Public Key. So SAE Public Key is an optional extension to WPA3, and it uses a public-private key pair where the password is derived from the public key. And this allows the client device to authenticate the network that it's connecting to, thus providing protection against evil twin attacks. And one of the key concepts to understand here is that the password is no longer being chosen by us silly humans, but is now being derived from the public key. Let me show you how that password is generated. So everything starts with the private key. And the private key is created using the elliptic curve digital signature algorithm. And in addition to the private key, we must also choose which elliptic curve we want to use. The WPA3 specification states that all devices must support the elliptic curve P256. However, other elliptic curves with more bits improving security, such as P384 and P521, can optionally be supported. But you may find some client devices will be unable to join your SSID if you use one of these optional curves. But once you have chosen which elliptic curve you want to use, we can now derive the public key from a point on our elliptic curve and the private key. Our password is in turn derived from the public key, but not in isolation. We also use the SSID name and a modifier. The modifier is a 128-bit randomly generated number. And from this position, we have two options. We can use security parameter 3 or security parameter 5. The goal of security parameter 3 is to generate a hash value that starts with 3 all 0 bytes. In the very likely event that our first hash attempt does not equal 3 0 bytes, we increase the modifier by a value of 1 and rerun the calculation. And we repeat this process again and again and again until we satisfy our requirement for 3 0 bytes. The goal of security parameter 5 is to generate a hash value that starts with 5 0 bytes. Now, that may sound like a trivial difference, but actually, it takes a lot more computing resource to use security parameter 5. So to give you an example, it takes my personal laptop, on average, about 5 to 15 seconds to find a valid hash using security parameter 3. It took the same laptop over 50 hours to find a valid hash using security parameter 5. Now, just to be clear, client devices will never have to make this calculation. This calculation is only done once at the point of SSID creation. And based on what already exists in the real world, I think it's fair to say we can expect Wi-Fi vendors to build password generation tools into their controllers, their management systems, but I think it's unlikely they'll be giving us the computing resource to use security parameter 5 in an acceptable time frame. So I think, at least for the time being, we'll all be using security parameter 3. But once you have found a valid hash with the correct number of 0 bytes, as part of our next calculation, we remove those 0 bytes and calculate our human-readable password. Or I should say, our list of possible human-readable passwords, as we can choose between several different passwords of varying length. The longer the password, the more secure, at the cost of usability for users who are manually typing in the password. Interestingly, there's a security researcher called Matthew Van Hoff, and he is famed for the discovery of the crack and Dragonblood Wi-Fi vulnerabilities. Well, he published a paper about SAE public key, and it's his recommendation that you should use security parameter 5 or a password of 16 plus characters. I personally think a password of 16 plus characters is the more practical of the two. Now, depending on your role in the network, there's only a subset of this information that's going to be relevant to you. If you're a user connecting to the Wi-Fi, the only thing you're interested in is the Wi-Fi password. If you're an administrator, like many of us in this room configuring the SSID, we'll likely be asked to choose which elliptic curve we want to use, and if we're even given the option, which security parameter. And we'll likely be relying on password generation tools to provide the private key, the public key, and find a valid modifier. But now that we have generated our password, we can start to connect client devices. And to do this, we have a new handshake that is very closely related to the simultaneous authentication of equals handshake. In fact, this handshake is so closely related that the first 3 messages are identical. The fourth message, which is still the SAE confirm message, now contains 3 new pieces of information. The modifier, which has been encrypted with the key encryption key to prevent eavesdroppers from using it to recalculate the Wi-Fi password, the public key, and a signature. The signature is comprised of the scalars, elements, MAC addresses of both client and AP. It also includes the public key and the modifier. All of these values are then signed with the private key. Now let's have a look at what our client device does with this new information. So the first thing our client device is going to do is to decrypt the modifier with the key encryption key. Our next step is to validate the public key. And for the client device to do this, it's going to take the modifier it's just decrypted, the public key it's just been sent, and the SSID name of the network it's joining. Using those 3 values, we can recalculate the Wi-Fi password. If the password we calculate is the same password we use to connect to the SSID, then we know our public key is valid and can be trusted. Our next and final step is to validate the signature. Now, the signature has been signed with the private key, and this means we can use our trusted public key to validate this signature. And assuming that our validation is successful, we can continue with WPA3 association and the four-way handshake. Now, let's take a look at this from a different perspective. Let's take a look at this from the perspective of a hacker who is trying to set up an evil twin attack against our new SAE public key SSID. And to set up that evil twin attack, a hacker will need the SSID name. Well, that's easy. Anybody can get that. They will need the Wi-Fi password. And for our example, we'll assume that the password has been compromised. But they will also need the private key to create a valid signature. And they're not going to have that information. Moreover, there's no reason to share that information with anyone because you don't need the private key to connect to the SSID. But what if our hacker doesn't give up so easily? What if they were to set up an SSID with the same name, the same password, even using simultaneous authentication of equals, but just without public key? Will client devices roam to that evil twin? And I'm pleased to say that they won't, because transition disable, which protects against this kind of downgrade attack, must be supported by all SAE public key devices. But there is still one small window of opportunity for our hacker. If a device is connecting to the network for the very first time, it's possible that they could connect to the evil twin before the genuine SSID, because the client device hasn't yet learned that the SSID should have been using a public key to begin with. However, we can still offer some level of protection for these users as well. It's possible to generate a Wi-Fi QR code that embeds the public key, thus informing the client device that it should only connect to an SSID if it's using that specific public key. Now, there are some parts of the Wi-Fi protocol that, for various reasons, exist on paper but don't make it into the real world. I'm pleased to say that simultaneous authentication of equals public key is not one of them. Today we have support from infrastructure and client vendors, but we are still in the early stages of adoption. Since its introduction to WPA3, we've seen a year-on-year growth in the number of newly certified devices that support SAE public key, but in 2024, it was still only about 1 in 80 newly certified devices. Hopefully, we see this trend continue to grow, as of course, adoption will be key to deployment. And as this is Wi-Fi Design Day, I thought it might be good to finish with my top design tips for deploying SAE public key. And my first tip is just to remember, not all devices, not even WPA3 devices, are guaranteed to support SAE public key. This is still an optional part of the WPA3 specification. But for devices that do support SAE public key, you can guarantee they'll support the elliptic curve P256. However, other elliptic curves are optional and may prevent some client devices from joining your SSID. One of the easiest ways to improve security on your SSID is to use a longer password, ideally of 16 plus characters. While it's technically possible to use the same private key across multiple SSIDs, I would encourage you not to do this, because if that private key were ever compromised, all associated SSIDs would also be compromised. So each time you create a new SSID, use a fresh private key. If you do have to print the Wi-Fi password, and I would rather that you didn't, but if you do have to print the Wi-Fi password, consider doing so with a QR code that embeds the public key, as this will provide that additional level of protection against evil twin attacks. And lastly, and I think this is one that's going to catch a lot of people out, because the Wi-Fi password is in part derived from the SSID name, changing the SSID name will also change the password. So if you do change your SSID name, please make sure that you rerun your password generation tool and update the password accordingly. And that's me finished. Thank you very much.